My name's John Hagestuen. I'm the head of research for BI Intelligence, which is Business Insider's subscription market research service. And prior to heading up research, I was a FinTech and payments analyst, which is why I'm sitting in this chair right now moderating this panel. And today we're going to be talking about innovation and transformation within the financial services industry. And we have a great group of panelists. And we're going to kick off by having each of them introduce themselves. And as you introduce yourselves, could you just answer one question? What's one trick that you use with your teams to make them more innovative? And we'll start with you.
Okay, my name's Eve Iratakis, and I'm head of product development for ACI worldwide. And we provide secure payment solutions around the globe. I have responsibility for the development organization, which resides in 30 countries. So one trick I use is I ask them to always give me an elevator pitch. If you have 30 seconds, tell me the value proposition, because you can't start talking about a lot of speeds, feeds, and other technical issues if you are stuck in an elevator for 30 seconds.
Got it. Thank you, Eve. Nans?
Yes, hi. I'm Nans Sivaram. I'm from Infosys. We are a global consulting technology services company. We also have products. And I head the global payments division for Infosys. And we're really excited to be here. This is the fourth year that we've been at Money20. And really glad to be part of the Innovators session. As far as what kind of a trick that I use to trigger innovation is one of empathy. I ask about what problem does this solve for your customer, because whatever we design, whatever we deliver ultimately touches somebody, some human at the other end. So I ask for what is the human problem that we're solving. So that gets my team thinking about what is the practical issue that we are after. So.
Excellent.
That's my trick.
Thank you, Nans. Jason?
Hi, good afternoon. Jason Bettinger. Bear with me on my voice. I think I'm losing it, but I work for Cisco Systems, and I work within a industry solutions group within Cisco Systems, and I run two industry work groups, one for financial services and one for retail. And the makeup of those work groups are all the different BEs and engineering teams within Cisco, as well as our field teams that are out with customers, and I have a team that's out with customers as well. And the real charter of that group is to kind of serve as one conduit back to our BEs and engineering teams to let them know what the requirements of these various industries are, of retail and of financial services, in hopes that that will inform their roadmap, their development roadmap, and then ultimately result in kind of a more robust set of industry-specific solutions for Cisco.
Got it. Great. So just to start off, we'll have a question for all of our panelists. What are the biggest barriers that financial institutions face when it comes to innovating, and not only innovating, but also transforming their organizations, going from that innovation to something that transforms the organization?
You want to start?
Go ahead, Eve.
Okay. So I'd say that, some of the barriers include, obviously a legacy infrastructure. Sometimes companies try to leverage their legacy infrastructure where new disruptors come in. They can start with a clean sheet of paper and they can get there sometimes faster than trying to bring forward legacy. Also culture, whether risk adverse or less risk adverse, sometimes that also impacts, the ability to innovate. And then of course, in terms of embracing some of the new technologies, whether new technologies are real new technologies that are on the market, or methodologies like moving to DevOps, in terms of being able to innovate on a rapid pace basis. So some of those become, your own internal barriers, and some are really external barriers.
Great. Anybody else want to add on to that?
I think I agree with Eve on the fact that legacy platforms and legacy processes that we have is the biggest drag, because you do spend a lot of money upkeeping these platforms, and the the existing players don't touch it unless it is a burning platform, and then they let it go for years on end, much beyond what it should have been. So I think to us, I agree with Eve on that particular point. That's one of the biggest barriers that we see. And as far as culture angle, I agree on that as well, because these are set mindsets that we have, and I think that's a big challenge too. I think ultimately it's one of finding the growth and finding those ideas that can drive growth. I think getting that all these different things solved for these companies to go after is usually a very high bar for them to act. So I think those are some of the big barriers that they struggle with.
So just to dig into that a little bit more, why you mentioned that the legacy infrastructure persists longer than it should. What's the reason that that's happening? Is it the culture that's kind of behind that, or?
I think it is the cost mostly because they've operated that way for a long time. They've made it very efficient, and for you to bring in new ideas, new technologies, you need to find investments, and for that you got to make the right type of business case for it, and they typically don't want to touch it unless it's something that's going to give them a big shock, either from a growth standpoint or some competition that's going to take things away from them. So they look for that type, and they wait for too long before they embark on these programs. And that, I think, is what the problem is in many cases that I've seen. So I would say that.
I mean, to add on to that, I think for us, it's competing goals that we see within financial services companies, right? So the goal of growth versus managing the risk associated with that, as well as running the business and in a lot of cases fixing the business, right? And innovation. And what we see is it's oftentimes easier to kind of build business cases and justification for kind of incremental innovation on products and services, not really change processes, et cetera. And then when you put those against more innovative things that are really looking at new models, it's much more difficult to put those things head to head. And when those things are competing against the same pool of dollars to get these things done, that can serve as a real challenge to get some of those more innovative type projects through.
Right.
So we see that a lot.
I think, too, that when you look at disruptions, I think the question, one of the things that comes up is, can you disrupt yourself? Are you capable of really doing that? Because by the time the disruption comes, it's usually like a falling knife, and it's really hard to catch up. In fact, I actually think it's always interesting, talking to potential employees, is to ask them, do you have battle scars? Have you lived through a disruption? Because you learn very quickly that you better be a rapid mover. And so, being afraid to innovate is not something you can have as you see industries that are moving at rapid paces.
Mm-hmm. Great. Nans, did you have something to add? It looked like you were about to say.
I think we addressed most of it, yeah.
Great. So next question, I think Business Insider is probably, it's to some degree at fault for this, but one of the prevailing narratives in financial services is that FinTech is going to upend all of these legacy players. There's a lot of innovative products that have come out of FinTech from a user experience standpoint and B2B as well, but are we seeing real innovation that's leading to transformation? Is the core business of financial services being upended by these players? And this is a question for anybody.
So I would say definitely it's having an impact. There is no doubt about it. As you rightly said, the user experience aspect of it, the fintechs have really led the way, no doubt in my mind. Airbnb, Uber, you can go any of these examples. Ultimately, what have they done differently? If you take Airbnb as an example, these kind of platforms existed before. What was unique about them? To me, it is the design that made the difference. To me, I think the fintechs have truly shown the existing players what it is to take care of customers, what it is to go after prospects, what it is to give a very engaging user experience. So I think they have definitely set the bar for them to follow. But again, in financial services, we have to be a little bit more realistic because you have a lot of regulations in play. Lending is one example I can think of where lending platforms have come, how they've figured out a way to partner with established players, and at the same time solve for some very unique experience-related issues, transparency-related issues. I think truly, I believe fintechs have done a great job in bringing out empathy for the customers and letting that drive design. And there is a lot to be learned for the existing players on that front. So that I would definitely accept. But yet, I think there's a lot of room for partnership and learning, and where you can collaborate. In my mind, it not necessarily need to be disruptive, but there is an opportunity to work together in my mind. So I think it's generally been a positive thing. And one last point I would like to add is that even the governments have taken notice, maybe not in the US, but if you look at other governments across the globe, in India, for example, they came out with a payments bank initiative where they said, hey, the established banks are not working hard enough to acquire new customers. Can we bring in new players who are high on technology and provide a differentiated experience? So the governments have acted, and they gave many more licenses to fintech companies that can start banks on a small scale. So I think that is an example of how people are noticing it. I truly believe this will be for the better in the long term.
I
mean-
also think that, whoops, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I also think that FinTech has, made some very, very significant inroads in terms of, one, their ability to focus. So they can take a problem or an opportunity and very razor focus on that opportunity to either be a disruptor or to add value. The other thing, too, is that they're not afraid to embrace new technology. I mean, things like leveraging the open source community. You see a number of fintechs that have figured out that they're going to leverage open source to a new level, as well as some of the newer technologies like containers, et cetera, in terms of being able to spin up services and introduce microservices into to infrastructure and be able to be very, very responsive to a specific need. So I think definitely influencing the landscape and also creating a sense of action in the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I think your point, Yvonne, on the focus, it's true. I mean, they picked out certain parts of the customer journey, right? They were causing more friction and brought a lot of capability to those sections. I think one of the challenges as legacy financial services companies start to work with fintechs, more and more fintechs in different parts of the journey, is orchestrating all of those capabilities and orchestrating that end-to-end customer experience that they're looking to present, to their customers. So true, they've had a huge impact, and potentially one of the downsides is a little more complexity, managing that orchestration.
Right. But I think ultimately, it goes back to how, these companies can collaborate. And I think the lending platforms offers a great example how, even though we talk of them as disruptors, but ultimately they work with banks. And banks provide them the regulatory cover and do the underwriting aspects of it. So I think it offers a great way to come together to really make a difference for the customers. I think these two ecosystems can really collaborate ultimately, in my opinion.
So that leads into my next question, and I think at Money 2020, in recent years, you've kind of seen the narrative change from one of fintechs kind of eating the bank's lunch to one of collaboration. The question that we get from clients all the time is, how do we actually effectively collaborate? How does a legacy institution work with one of these companies that might be hyper focused on one user experience? How do they integrate that effectively?
I think we need to look at areas where you want to transform and where you want to make a difference, where you see that there is a lack in it. That is, I'm empathizing right now with the large financial institutions. We have talked to a number of banks, and they feel that, hey, maybe we're not doing underwriting well enough, because some of these fintechs are talking about considering a lot many more data beyond what we use to underwrite. Perhaps we can do a better job doing that. So perhaps we have to take some of these core areas where you want to make a difference, and then look around for partnerships where others have done better, and bring some of them in and maybe give them a platform to operate, because you have a great base of customers. and see if we can put things together, integrate things together, and go to market quickly. So ultimately, this is about trial, test, launch, and learn quickly. So I think we need to think about how we can innovate and get to market faster. So instead of taking a lot of time working with legacy platforms, taking 12 months to launch a program, can you work with some of these partners to get something out there in 3 months and then launch it, learn from it, and then again iterate? So to me, it is going to be one of accelerating this innovation, accelerating things to market, and take advantage of some of these guys who have already done some legwork and build on top of it. So instead of working with the legacy and taking a long time to get something out there, and then realizing, what, the goalpost is moved. In my mind, some of the financial services companies that I work with have thought of them, bringing them in as early on in a program, and then launching it quicker. So that's one paradigm that I've seen. Maybe you guys can comment.
So I think one of the areas is of course on the UI. I think one of the things you have to do is make sure that the user experience brings continuity across those cooperations. So for example, you look at some of the best in the marketplace. I mean, you look at Apple. Who wouldn't be able to identify an Apple device because the user experience? So I think there has to be some brand equity created on the user experience so that that partnership leverages a look and feel that can be an identifier to the brand. And I think that if you can establish some of those table stakes, and I think take advantage of some of the rapid prototyping and feedback loop with customers through Agile and DevOps, but not compromise on that user experience as it relates to brand equity across them. I think it can bring the best of both worlds.
Right.
Secure solutions rolled out at rapid pace, but with an experience that is branded to the corporation.
So one other point I would like to add on that, which I think the large financial institutions have started doing, is they all have their venture funds. They have teams that are looking at scanning the landscape to look at what are the innovative fintechs doing. So some of them are investing, some of them are taking partnerships with them, giving the platform that they have to come and collaborate and innovate. So I think that is also a very interesting way to get fintechs to work with these players, because they have hundreds of large institutional customers, maybe thousands, maybe millions of small business customers. So opening that as a platform and allowing some of these fintechs to experiment would be another way to foster innovation, and I see some of them doing that. So I think that's another example how we could bring these two ecosystems together.
Anything to add, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd say is we continue at Cisco, obviously, given the business that Cisco is in, is creating a more agile and updated network infrastructure. And so in parallel with everything that's been mentioned, I mean, we're very much focused on that piece of it. When we think about transformation with fintechs, there's definitely phases that you go through. And what we like to do, and we know everybody might be, and we call those phases enabling and differentiating and finally defining new business models. And for a lot of the fintech or financial services firms we work with, there's a lot of gaps and things that need to be addressed in that enablement phase, even though we're focused on a lot of the things in that differentiate phase with fintechs, et cetera. So we think it just needs to happen in parallel. Obviously, we're not going to do one, in lieu of the other. They both need to happen. But that's the area that we're mostly focused on.
Got it.
Yeah.
Nans, you talked a little bit about moving ideas into reality very quickly. And when you're doing that with a legacy institution, who are the people that usually are the hardest to convince, and what sorts of questions are they asking? How do you move that along from an organizational perspective?
So I think some of the hardest folks to convince would be the security side of things, because there's a lot of concerns, with what has happened of late. Does it open up some new areas, unknowns, basically, the concerns around what kind of challenges that may exist. Inadvertently, you could end up opening up. So I think, to me, security is one. And the other thing is about where do you have the infrastructure? I mean, this seems to be a big conversation that happens. Okay, am I going to have it within my own data centers? Am I going to go elsewhere and maybe take a cloud-based, public cloud-based solution? I think these are the type of questions that that get a lot of attention, and a lot of time is wasted on that. I think some of these should be addressed, ahead of time, and some set principles should be put in place so you can quickly figure out, instead of taking everybody through the same process, you just pre-bake some of these questions and be clear about what you're going to do. If it is going to be to deal with sensitive data, obviously, you're going to take a certain approach. If not, it is simply going to be a front-end, experience-oriented solution. You take another approach. So I think we got to have some set patterns and makes those decisions ahead of time, so that way, you don't need to take every one of these partnerships through the same set of 20 questions and put them through the ringer. I feel, that is one way I think we should definitely ease the process and maybe get to accelerate innovation. So, that's one thing that I can think of. I don't know.
You have a lot of experience with digital transformation, so maybe you can bring it down to ground level for our audience and just go, if you had a new partner that wanted to build a new user experience, step by step, how do you make that organizational change work so that you can get an effective result?
So I think first you look at the user, the target customer base, and you segment that. So because sometimes they're not all the same in terms of those segmentations. And then as you look at what you need to change, one is to understand some of the problem areas, some of the areas that either the user interface or experience is just not intuitive, because I think we've become, so driven by the mobility movement in terms of things, that user experience being intuitive. Nobody wants to study how to use an interface. They want to be able to experience it and figure it out as they go. So I think what you have to do then is you have to build in a rapid prototyping development environment. So with continuous improvement, bring it to the user with the partner and continuously create that feedback loop. And I think that feedback loop is good from both the customer adoption, the end customer adoption, as well as the value chain along the way, because developers then get closer and closer to how the customer is experiencing their product, and so on, to bring that. I think one of the things we get hung up on is your ability to innovate doesn't have to be at the same pace as your customer's ability to consume it. And I think sometimes we try to force it out there, and we assume that the innovation has to happen at the same rapid prototype being modeled that the customer also has to experience it. So you also have to break up how fast they can, depending on the application, how fast that end target user can consume it to, not slow down how rapidly you're responding to it. So I think you have to also understand that piece of it as well.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Nans. So one trend we've been seeing across the globe is the move towards open APIs in financial services. In Europe and the UK, it's being brought on primarily from regulation. And then in other parts of the world, some legacy institutions are just doing it because they kind of see that this is where things are going and they want to get ahead of it. So how would you say that this trend is going to impact innovation and transformation in financial services?
Absolutely. I think the reason why this is happening is because the governments are thinking, okay, the established banks have their own customer base, but they also see that the experience that they're getting, or even simply that the banks are not working hard enough to acquire these customers, because if these are only 8 or 10 players out there, everybody has to necessarily bank with one of them. So, and if these people have a ton of legacy, that means there is no real motivation to change. So they really want to, bring in innovation, and the way they do that is by making a level playing field for everybody to participate and bring in more competition. So that is taking on a wide range of expressions in terms of regulations. At the simplest level, we have seen the PSD2, we have seen the open banking out in Europe. which is all about exposing APIs that you can read, you can write, therefore allowing others to kind of consume these types of APIs to provide more intuitive user interface and a little bit more functional way to interact with the money that they have or the banking services that that they may consume. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is some governments are taking even more of a dramatic approach by building country-specific platforms. I can think of India, I can think of UK faster payments, I can think of NPP in Australia. Those are all country platforms which allow the interconnection between the banks and enable faster payments. And in some cases, they are even doing the aliasing, which is that you don't need to reveal your bank account routing information, bank account information to get money, because this is one of those big privacy items. Because if I write a check, you get to know a lot of information about me, which I may not really want. So if you do aliasing, what happens is, I can work with my payment service provider, get a token, and then give you the token, and then that token goes away at the end of that. So these are some innovations that they want to build some common platform on top of which other players can come and collaborate and create some innovative solutions. So we are seeing a range of things. In the US, obviously, we have set up a task force which has come together and it has looked at it in so many different angles. In US, obviously, there are so many parties here, and there is a lot more action that has already happened. So US is in a different bracket altogether. But globally, I think governments have taken a lot more action because they wanted to leapfrog. They want to bring in innovative technologies because they have lagged for ages, and this gives them a great opportunity to really jump ahead or at least be at par, with the developed countries. So therefore, I see action out in the developing countries a lot more, and I think we're going to see this trend continue. There is no question about it.
Well said, yeah, and that's actually my next question. I know Jason wanted to talk about this a little bit too, Nans, and Eve, if you want to jump in as well. I mean, does transformation look different in different markets around the globe, and what can U.S. institutions learn from other markets that are doing it really well?
I mean, you mentioned a lot of the examples. I mean, some of it obviously being regulated. We got some compelling events that are driving that transformation in other markets. In other places in Asia, for instance, I mean, if you look at some of the bank concepts that have been rolled out there, it's just that has been possible because of some of the investments they're making in terms of, and I know some of the U.S. banks are already making these investments too, specialists in design, in user experience, in customer experience, really changing the types of people that we're bringing on board. And that's allowed them to really roll out things that, we're not seeing yet, in the States, in some of the Asian banks, for instance. So, I think it's a combination of the resources that we're bringing on board at the different institutions, and then some of the compelling events around regulations that are, that I think are driving it mostly.
Right.
Yeah.
I think along the same lines as what Jason's comment, I think there's several places that become compelling events that drive transformation. So obviously, regulation. I also think that legacy. You'll see that sometimes innovations happen faster where there is no base. So some of the third world countries, you'll see a more rapid take rate because you're not dealing with the legacy environment. And then other compelling events, both opportunity, but also threat. Sometimes you'll see a move that happens because threat becomes real faster, and it makes a move to, renovating some of the existing infrastructure. So I think there's several different compelling events that can drive that change.
Right. I agree with that. So I think, it will take a different shape and form for different countries. I don't think it's going to look alike, primarily because of, what the regulations are, what is happening within a particular country. Again, India example comes to my mind because several years back, they rolled out the Universal Identity Project. They call it Aadhaar. And now about 1.3 billion Indian citizens are enrolled in it, biometrically identifiable. And therefore, it's a great way to quickly identify who it is, do your KYC. Therefore, customer onboarding or any kind of background checks can be done very quickly. So in India, things are going to look different because you can always leverage this platform, be it getting on new customers, given in a bank or in any other, or even for a mobile operator, you want to sign up somebody, you don't need a touch of paper. You just come and digitally sign in. So I think, therefore, given the ecosystem that is developed within the country is going to determine a lot about how things will evolve. So clearly that's going to be the case. In the US, obviously, we are taking a more collaborative approach, a task force-based approach to transformation. Therefore, it's going to be a little bit frustrating, but I think over time we will eventually get better because the market forces will lead the change. And therefore, I think it will take a little bit longer, but it won't be a step change like these countries because they've languished for a long time without the technology, and suddenly they're absorbing it. It won't be that type of a change, but this will be a more an incremental change over time. But I think we will eventually absorb these innovations to make things better ultimately.
Which is a better route to go, incremental or the way that India is?
It's incremental or it depends. I mean, you really it depends is the answer.
Yeah.
The consultant speak tells me it depends, but if there is such a big difference between where you are today and where things are at, then I think a step change, dramatically leapfrogs you. I think in those instances it makes sense, but here you cannot take sides in the US. I mean, you got so many different perspectives, so many different players. Be it the networks, be it the merchants. You cannot make sudden moves, and you got to let the market drive some of this change, and that's how things are evolving here. So therefore, it will be incremental in for the most part, unless of course there is some dramatic solutions out there that develop. But I feel, given the conditions, this is the best way to go about it.
Kind of table stakes now, right? Incremental innovation. I mean, I think is table stakes. I mean, that's something we all need to be doing, continuously. So I think the answer is you got to do both, right? And the incremental piece is just as important, if you want to kind of maintain your market share, right, and maintain your competitive position. So, yeah.
Great. So let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about specific technologies and trends. So Jason, is blockchain going to live up to the hype? Is it doing something that that wasn't available in financial services before?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, offering up a more transparent, right, distributed, efficient, and secure technology is offering a new capability. I mean, there are so many use cases for blockchain that it's hard to think that it won't become something that is more pervasive. But in the end, it's a technology, and if you look, I read something in the Harvard Business Review very recently. I don't know if anybody saw it, but they likened blockchain to the TCP/IP protocol. And the fact that was rolled out and introduced about 30 years before the TCP/IP protocol really became standard. And not saying the blockchain is going to take that long. Obviously, our cycles have greatly increased since then. And the fact is, I mean, some of the use cases for blockchain across a number of different industries, the one that really makes blockchain pervasive may not have been, we may not be pursuing that right now. So it's hard to say. I think there's too many use cases for it not to be, but I think it is a number of years away before we get out of the very specific localized uses of blockchain that we're seeing today, for cross-border payments, etc.
Yeah. If you do a straw poll in Money 2020, this year versus last year, the lines for blockchain were much longer last year than for blockchain discussions this year. This year it is all about AI. clearly, I think we are going through a hype cycle, and things seems to have pulled back. I was listening to Max Levchin on day one when he talked about blockchain as a hammer waiting to find some nails. So it is. I think we are yet to see the full extent of what it can do. But if you just use it as a technology, but there are other competing solutions out there, it's simply a distributed database. I'm saying this because not because I don't believe that this can provide some results in the long term, but I think it has to be seen in the right perspective, and it probably will take some more time to evolve in my mind. And then again, for example, we have done a lot of work with many banks because we have core banking platforms. We brought together a syndicate of banks that wanted to try out some of the use cases. We developed 40 different use cases. So I've looked at all of them, but I still think that is any of them a silver bullet out there? I don't see it. I could have realized many of them so many different ways from a technology perspective. I think this is a space that we have to watch, but I don't see anything shattering, putting a dent on the universe yet, emerging out of the space.
I think too that like a lot of emerging technologies, I think that you'll start to see some collision of other use cases, not where it targeted. So things that we're starting to see are things like liquidity management across accounts, or identity management without exposing user proprietary information. So areas which was not in the initial line of sight, but become more viable leveraging blockchain. So I think that's typical as you see emerging technology go through their hype and then get grounded in trying to really solve a problem.
Yeah, it's disruptive, but not in the way that you thought it was
Yeah,
going to be.
exactly.
I mean, to be widely deployed, I think ultimately it's not about the technology, right? I mean, it's about standards, it's about governance, and until some of those things, and we're figuring that out, right? Until some of those things are in place, it's going to be really difficult for it to play a major role.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that actually is one of the things that stops promising technologies and has in financial services for a long time. You basically have a very high compliance regulatory barrier that could stifle something that's like a really good idea in concept, but doesn't necessarily play out in real life.
Yeah.
I think we have to look beyond financial services. There could really be some good applications for this, particularly in large manufacturing companies where they integrate components and parts from thousands of different suppliers. Possibly, you can think of using a blockchain where you can get better insights into where different parts are in the certification process, in the development process, and so forth. And that can provide better visibility. Maybe that is a possibility for us to apply blockchain. But then again, you can also do it in other ways because it's simply a technology solution, and you could do other ways in which you could realize the same thing. So I think we're going to see this evolve. There is no doubt about it. But it's going to be much beyond where we thought originally that this is going to make a difference.
Right. Nans, you mentioned AI a little bit earlier, and how it's kind of the thing that's in vogue at Money 2020 this year. How far along are we with AI? Can you give us some examples of how it's actually being used to be effective, and how it's going to transform payments?
As my own impression, one of the things that I do is I walk the halls just to get a feel for what's going on in Money 2020. And this time, obviously, there are so many AI players. And one really caught my attention. These guys were offering, it's one of the startups offering hyperparameter tuning as a service. So that I thought, okay, that is interesting because it's not just AI, but it is far deep into it. But clearly, I think AI has come of age, and the fact that we have tremendous amount of compute, lot of data, and some really good range of algorithms that are available today means that wherever you have human heuristics, where human decision making is involved, you can clearly use AI to augment it right off the bat. I think there is no doubt about it. And many of our customers are talking about it. And even earlier this year, the Google CEO talked about AI first. We've talked about mobile first in the years past, and people are now embracing AI first as an approach. So you got to really start thinking about what are the implications of that. And early on, in one of the sessions I attended, they really talked about, the need to have AI not being biased with the human decision making that we do today, taking out variables that uh, don't take into account too much of who the person is as opposed to what the person is doing. So we got to really think about how to protect AI from developing bias and understanding why it makes the decision that it makes. Because there are some models and algorithms out there that won't explain it well enough. So I think there is enough out there today that AI is, I truly believe that is ready to make a difference if many of them are embracing it. I think that's the right way to go. I think we have to integrate this into our business processes, into managing and upkeep of platforms. So there are a range of use cases that I find very exciting in this space. It is definitely this is real because it makes a difference to the bottom line, I believe. If you want to add.
I mean, it, we're seeing applications of it. I don't know if anybody's heard of the network intuitive that Cisco recently put out there in the market. But I mean, we're leveraging a great deal of AI within our network platform. We're leveraging AI to configure wireless access points and the way the devices operate on those access points. So I mean, we're using a tremendous amount of it today, kind of behind the scenes, applications of AI that you don't see. So don't disagree with anything that's been said, but it's interesting to note that how much it is actually being used
Right.
in various in institutions in the network right now that we really don't talk about that much.
Yeah. The other point I would like to add is that AI is truly a deep domain in itself, and that is on one hand. A lot of fintech companies are out there. On the other hand, AI without the domain knowledge, without say applying it in lending or applying it in understanding customer preferences, applying it in personalization, that is bringing AI closer to a domain where you want to see the benefit. So we have existing, folks who are subject matter experts in these domains. We have subject matter experts in AI. I think the companies need to figure out a way to kind of bring these two things together better and faster. Knowing AI alone is not going to be sufficient. Knowing the domain alone is not going to be sufficient. I think we got to, allow some bit of cross-pollination to happen to really find a good intersection of rich use cases. I think we got to create these community of practices within enterprises to really take advantage of this technology. Some of our players have started doing it, but I think we need to do a lot more in terms of creating these groups that can bring the deep domain expertise and also an appreciation for AI together to make the most of this.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I was talking to the head of Watson yesterday, actually, and he said exactly the same thing. He said that they have these guys that are coming out of college. They're 2 or 3 years into their career, and they're designing the AI platforms, but they don't have that domain expertise. So it works. What they're doing works in the lab, but once they get it out of the lab, it's very hard to get it to work for real world applications.
Very true.
Yeah.
And I think it is having a pervasive impact talking about young kids picking it up. I mean, I go to Stanford from time to time to talk to the kids out there and maybe on a recruitment mission. Everybody practically talks about AI. And I think, I think the current crop of graduates are all AI enabled, which is a great thing. So that has now become such an entrenched part of the curriculum now. We have to get this type of different talent embedded deeply within the enterprise and then allow innovation to happen. So I think this is going to be a cultural shift without a question.
Great. Eve, anything to add?
No, I think most of the comments have already been made. I think that, obviously the crossover with big data is key in terms of, learning models. I think you see, a lot of opportunity there across a number of use cases.
Great. Jason, one of the biggest and persistent trends in payments and financial services in general is the increasing breaches that are happening. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the need for payment security is shaping innovation within financial services.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's good to talk about it even outside of the payment realm, because I mean with the prevalence of new endpoints, devices, additional data, etc. I mean we need to look at security at all levels. We need to look at security at the application level, the device level, down to the network level, and so an end to end look at security is very important. I mean, we talk about payments in particular. Um, Obviously, I think the challenge there is we've got a number of different authentication methods right out there today. It's balancing that with what we're trying to do on the other end, which is create a frictionless payment and completely seamless and easy payment mechanism. So I think you're seeing that with some of the things in Europe with PSD2. Some of the challenges that the banks are running up against are kind of raising their hand to say, hey, wait a minute. We've kind of got to balance that aspect of it. So I think ultimately things like biometrics obviously are going to be key to kind of creating that very frictionless payment experience that we're looking for.
Right.
But again, I wouldn't focus it as much just on the payment transactions itself, but that security needs to be pervasive, and there's a whole new kind of threat landscape out there, and we've got to go well beyond where we went in the past to protect ourselves. Yeah.
That's right. I agree with that.
I
Go
agree. I agree as well. I think, as Jason points out, you got to look at every level, and so you have to basically make sure that you're vigilant on every level, whether it's the application level, the infrastructure, data network, and also the access. Because I think typically you look at some of our use cases and solutions, and there's that gray area of the access level. So I think all those have to be taken into consideration. You have to look at by both dynamic and static as it relates to how you're handling internally some of the security issues, and then of course vulnerability management. It's a big ticket item, and one that you just have to be on top of to be able to manage your security end to end.
Absolutely. You can never be satisfied. As you rightly said, there is the internal security aspect of it, identity access management, and those aspects, external aspects of it, how are you providing access, and so forth. And then you talked about biometrics. Again, that's an interesting topic that is evolving, and again, it's found a lot of mention here as well. So I think we're only as good as the weakest link in your chain. Particularly, data has to be secured no matter what, whether it is data at rest or data in motion. You got to take care of these aspects. So these are all table stakes, to be perfectly honest. And then comes, how we're going to reduce the friction in payments. And I think biometric is a good way to move forward. We're talking about, I was looking at a Gartner report, 600 million devices that are going to have biometric capabilities by 2021. That's a huge number. So we got to definitely think about how we're going to harness that potential. At the same time, we have to be careful because you're going to store information about the individual, and these are all personally identifiable information, and therefore there's not real a protection that exists today. And I think we got to really be careful about how we're going to use this technology as well. And things will evolve in this space. FIDO is doing some good work, but regardless, I think this has got both pros and cons that need to be deliberated on before we jump into embracing it completely. But biometrics is here to stay, no doubt about it.
Great. One last question for you, Nans, and anybody else who wants to jump in, and then we'll have a little bit of time for our audience to ask questions. So the last technology that I want to talk about is mobile wallets. I'll be the first to say that a few years ago I made a forecast that said these things were going to take off really, really fast. I think I had a really good logic for that. It just didn't turn out to be the reality of the situation. But at the same time, if you look at it in Asian countries, they've actually taken off very quickly. So, are they going to become the primary device for making transactions in the U.S.? And is there things that we can learn from Asian countries where it's actually going really well?
So I didn't get the first part of the question. This is about
Mobile wallets.
mobile wallets.
Yep,
Okay.
yep, yep, yeah.
Yeah. So, mobile wallets. We saw the Apple Pay launch. How the acceptance has dramatically improved. When you use it, it is clearly a great experience. I obviously use Apple Pay quite a bit. I have used Starbucks. I mean, most of us use Starbucks wallet. I mean, it makes a big difference in terms of payments, how simple they've made it to reload, and the fact that loyalty comes in seamlessly. It's a great example. Even Walmart Pay has done a pretty good job bringing a wallet solution together. So we're going to see these experiments out there, and we're going to see more Android Pay as well, Samsung Pay, not to mention that. So I think these are really good ways to kind of build the customer trust at the end of the day. And I think we're also seeing in some markets beyond the 20 that Apple is in, for example, where the banks want to get into branded wallets as well. So where they already have mobile experience and they want to provide mobile payments adjacent to that. And all of this security is going to be a key underpinning for this. Again, networks are upping the game because they are allowing easier way to tokenize. So it protects the data that needs to reside on the mobile wallets, because there is a lot of possibility that things can go wrong if somebody jailbreaks. What happens, and can you access some of this data, and what could happen with that? So we have to really think about it. But I'm happy to see that tokenization, consuming that, has become a lot easier in the last year or so. Visa has come out with it. MasterCard has come out with it. So we just have to figure out a way to protect and build that trust. But I think this innovation is for the taking. A lot of interesting things can happen with mobile wallets. And obviously, in countries like India, the experimentation has rapidly increased because the country went through a demonetization exercise where they, one fell swoop, they took a lot of 80% of the currency out of circulation, and that was a big impact. And it forced people to think about of electronic ways of payment, and therefore it put a shock in the system. But other places, gradually it will increase. Although I do have to admit that I saw a report recently, JP Morgan and Forrester said that in the last 7 or 8 months, the mobile wallet adoption has not really increased. It has gone down by a percentage point. I don't know how they arrived at a very specific percentage point from 15% to 14%. But the reality of it is we're going to go through some of this in fits and starts. But I do think in the long run, given the proliferation of smart devices, mobile wallets is going to become mainstream a lot more than what it is today. That's that.
I think that, they haven't necessarily lived up to the expectation. And I think part of the problem is related to the use case. To me, just replacing my wallet isn't good enough. So I think until you see innovation drive the use cases where it's really driving incremental value for the customer's experience, I don't think you're going to see the take rate. The novelty's there, but and I think the infrastructure's there, and I think there's been a lot of the kinks worked out in terms of how you deliver it across the ecosystem of mobile devices, regardless of whether it's Android or iOS, et cetera. But I think it still comes back to the use cases. And those use cases aren't on the market yet. Now, of course, there's markets like India that I think created disruptions that gave an entry vehicle. But I think in terms of the broader market, you still need use cases. And by the way, I think they'll come. I think you've seen historically in the market as different technologies have evolved, that where you create the opportunity, usually innovators fill it. And I think a great, historical one is on bandwidth. You only had bandwidth glut for any moment for a moment in time before, as the price of bandwidth dropped, innovators found ways to fill that creatively with customers. So I think the opportunity is there, but there's got to be a lot more focus on use cases.
Well said. Jason, anything to?
No, I totally agree. I think it goes beyond the payment transaction. I mean, it's almost just as easy, right, to use the credit card until you add on those additional values onto the using the mobile wallet. And, I think that'll help. Right?
Great. So now we have a little bit of time to take questions from our audience, if there are any out there.
Great.
Nope. Oh, there's one.
Yeah. So I'd be curious to know. So at the end of the day, what's your call of action for folks here in the room listening to you?
So I would say, innovation is here to stay. You got to definitely take care of the changes in the customer behavior. The customer behavior and the customer engagement experience is being set by players outside of financial services. A lot of the tech players are setting that, and therefore you got to watch it and make sure that you don't fall behind too much, or your experience is poor in comparison to what they get out of these tech companies. I'm talking about maybe as simple as a Netflix or a Google. The way in which you interact with some of these platforms is phenomenally simple and very natural to interact with. And therefore, I think we have to make sure that we take care of our customers and make sure that you watch for these innovations that's happening out there, and continue to find ways in which you can experiment, test, and track them. Because ultimately, if you don't do that, you're going to lose it, or you're going to become disintermediated by these players. People are going to go to Facebook Messenger and get information, and your brand is not going to be there front and center, at least from a financial services perspective. I would say that watching your consumers is very critical.
I think that the expectations are high for frictionless payment methodologies, and they're coming from a number of different application segments. And I think you have to be ready to innovate or integrate, and integrate through open APIs, but to enable a solution and a set of solutions that are going to be responsive to the market, with understanding the competitive landscape isn't going to be sitting still.
Yeah. I'd say a couple different things, and I never answered your question to how I get my teams to innovate, right? And within Cisco, and given we're so focused on technology, one of the things I do with all my technology teams and salespeople alike would be to stop thinking about the technology, stop focusing on that, focus really on the experience we're trying to deliver, regardless if you feel like you've got that capability today or not. I'd say open yourself up to working with a very broad set of ecosystem partners, and potentially partners you've not worked with in the past. And finally, I would say, we at Cisco obviously are very, we're always dealing with the IT side of the business. When we see the IT strategy not aligned with the business strategy, it slows things down, and it's still a major gap, and I think in a lot of our customers. So to the extent you can put people in charge of that and focus on bringing those two together, I think you'll have more success.
I think we have time for one more question if anybody has one. No? No? All right. Right there.
Sorry, last question. How much does build versus buy inhibit your innovation or willingness to move forward down a product path, so that you say, well, I want to own the IP versus I want to partner with a FinTech? And how does that limit you guys when you think about it in that way in your companies?
From the perspective of it all depends on how core it is to your business. I think in many instances, if it is it is your bread and butter, and it is the data that you already have, and it is about putting that together to make it to make the innovation happen. That means you're better off keeping it in house. It ultimately it's about how core it is and how much of your own data that you're going to leverage to bring this particular product out. And if it is going to be closer to data, closer to your core, you're better off with build, in my mind. But if it is going to be an edge innovation that you want to try and test and trial, and learn from it, then you could potentially think about bringing in a fintech player or somebody else to try and accelerate this. So that's the pattern that I've seen out there.
I think a lot has to do with time to market and how much runway you have in terms of your decision of build or buy. But I think that you have to be good at both. And that means that you can leverage technology that's in the marketplace and be a good integrator, and then focus your core assets in those areas that you can really build something that's differentiated. I think oftentimes companies make a build decision and they're really building something that's Me Too, already well provided in the marketplace, because they feel they've missed a window, and usually it's a good opportunity to look at how to leverage what's already out there.
Right.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think it's not as black and white, as necessarily build buy, that we see. It's a lot of it now is, I mean, there's a lot of different combinations, hybrids of things you can do to bring forward. So I tend to agree with what Eve just said, that most of the time, I think you'd probably be better off going with some kind of hybrid of the two.
Right.
And it's really defining the different capabilities you're trying to bring together, and which pieces you're going to do what for.
Yeah, a footnote to be added there also is the fact that open source is taken off in a big way. So I think it's important to kind of assess how much of that you can leverage. I think a lot of companies are doing that instead of build versus buy and potentially open source. You have many more options to consider. So.
Great. Thank you all for joining, and big round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.